My name's Judy Ancel. I live in Kansas City, where I've been a labor educator for almost 3 decades. And I also do a radio show called the Heartland Labor Forum on KKFI, Kansas City Community Radio, for decades as well. And I do labor solidarity in Honduras and Mexico with an organization called the Cross Border Network. I want to talk about the attack on teaching about race, which is erroneously called critical race theory. It's also an attack on teaching in our public schools of labor history, the history of a majority of people in this country. A majority of whites, a majority of Blacks, a majority of Latinx people, a majority of all of us are in the working class. As I said, I'm a labor educator, and I've taught labor history to college classes and to unions through my labor education program at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, a public university, since the 1990s. Invariably, the history of the working class is a revelation to both workers and college students. They may know small pieces of it. They may know about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire or the auto sit-down strikes in Flint, Michigan, and they may know that Martin Luther King was assassinated during a strike of sanitation workers. But beyond individual episodes, they have no inkling of the role and contributions of the working class of all races and genders, or the constant attempts by employers to keep us divided. I think this is why so many high school kids hate history. The history they learn bores them because it's not their history. It's the history of rich white guys who are the only ones that the elites, the powerful, the Ron DeSantis's, the Donald Trumps want American children to learn. And it's a fairy tale. They don't want us, the working class majority, to learn about our own history, because if we learn it right, then we learn about power in the system that preserves power for the wealthy. For instance, take the history of my city, Kansas City. Its history is one of segregation of whites from Black and even from Mexican Americans and immigrants. But in the meatpacking industry, whose heyday here was from the late 1880s through the 1950s, all three groups, including many Croatian immigrants, got jobs. The bosses kept these groups divided in different job categories and also by gender. For instance, Croatians in menial jobs, along with white Catholics, some of whom were foremen, Protestants in the skilled trades and supervisory positions, Black men on the kill floor, and along with white troublemakers in the hide cellar, white women in trimming and packaging, and Black women in the hog offal department. The Mexicans were banished to the river where they cut ice during the winter to preserve the meat, and they lived in boxcars. So wages for them, for all of these people, were low and work was dangerous. It was only when determined organizers, some of whom were communists, were able to build an organizing committee which represented all, could any of the groups see improvements. They did this through the United Packing House Workers Union, a union committed to racial unity. To do that took patience and an understanding of the historical divisions they had to overcome and of the inherent racism that the employers were practicing. When my students learned what was required to organize these folks in examples like this, they learn important lessons about organizing workplaces today, lessons that today's elites don't want them to learn. It's dangerous for the powerful to allow the teaching of history like this. This isn't the first time demagogic politicians have tried to erase the systemic understanding of how race and class interact to keep the majority powerless. It happened during the McCarthy era in the 1950s, when thousands of teachers lost their jobs and books were banned. And censorship of what is to be taught, of course, goes back to colonial days. I went to public school in the 1950s and 60s, and I received a rather sanitized and patriotic version of history. When I woke up to the reality of racism and imperialism as the news of the civil rights movement in the Vietnam War burst the fairy tale version that I'd been fed, I was very angry. I realized that I'd been miseducated into complacency and acceptance of the status quo. I felt betrayed, as did many of my generation. Knowing we'd been given a fairy tale version of American history radicalized us. Today, the attack on so-called woke education is a reaction by elites afraid of losing power to the growing anti-racist consciousness among youth and to the browning of America. It's also a cynical ploy by neoliberals like Missouri's Show Me Institute, led by millionaire Rex Sinkfield, to discredit public education so as to eliminate it, to privatize it. They think they can stop change by reinventing a false version of American history and using it as a means of social control. If you don't know your history, you not only don't know where you came from, but you also don't know what's possible for the future and what's been possible in the past. The right wing today is attempting to brainwash the next generation while they lock us into some kind of fascist future. That's why it's so important to oppose banning books and the falsification of our history. We need teachers and parents to link arms and tell their school boards and their state governments that we want honest education, not propaganda. We need our children to learn to think critically, and that history, with all its contradictions, is a great way to develop great minds for democracy. Maybe we also need 1,000 book clubs with reading lists that debunk the version of history being pushed by the right.